What if Britain's first global role was not as an empire, but as a supplier, not of ideas or power, but of a single material others could not do without? Because long before Britain was a nation, it was already part of a wider world. Welcome to the making of Britain. Long before written history in Britain, before Rome, before even the idea of Britain itself, there was a demand that reached across continents. Bronze, the defining material of an entire age, required two components, copper and tin. Copper was relatively widespread. Tin was not. It was scarce, unevenly distributed, and essential. Without it, bronze could not be made. This imbalance created networks of exchange that stretched far beyond local communities. It connected distant regions, linking producers and users in ways that were not immediately visible, but deeply significant. At the far western edge of Europe lay a region that would become central to this story, Cornwall. Here, tin deposits were relatively accessible, often found in stream beds or close to the surface. For early communities, this made extraction possible without the need for advanced technology. Over time, knowledge of these deposits spread. The metal itself began to move, carried along routes that connected Britain to continental Europe and beyond. This was not trade in the modern sense, with formal systems and recorded transactions. It was a network of exchange built on relationships, necessity, and opportunity. It's important to recognise that at this stage, there was no unified Britain participating in trade. There were communities, settlements and regions, each operating within its own context. And yet, through tin, these communities became part of something larger. The movement of materials created connections that transcended local boundaries. Objects made from bronze, tools, weapons and ornaments, circulated widely, carrying with them the imprint of the resources from which they were made. In this way, the land itself became part of a broader system, long before political or cultural unity emerged. Tin did not move on its own. It travelled through a series of exchanges, passing from one group to another, moving gradually across landscapes and seascapes. Coastal routes played a key role, as did river systems that allowed materials to be transported inland. Over time, these routes became established, not as fixed roads, but as patterns of movement understood by those who used them. The journey from Cornwall to the eastern Mediterranean, where bronze was widely used, was long and complex. It involved multiple stages, multiple intermediaries, and a degree of uncertainty. And yet it happened often enough to sustain demand. At this point, it's worth considering how we think about those early networks. Do they resemble trade as it is understood today, or do they represent something different? Something less structured, but no less important. When resources move across such distances without central coordination, what does that suggest about human connection and cooperation? Share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding how those early systems worked helps explain how larger, more formal networks developed later. The importance of tin in ancient Britain did not go entirely unnoticed by later writers. Classical sources, including those of Pytheas of Massalia, refer to islands associated with tin production, sometimes described in ways that blend observation with speculation. These accounts are not always precise, and they reflect the limits of knowledge at the time. But they do suggest that Britain, or at least parts of it, were known beyond their immediate region. Tin gave this distant land a form of recognition, a place within a wider geographical imagination. While tin connected Britain to distant regions, its impact was also felt locally. Extraction required labour, knowledge and organisation. Communities developed skills related to locating, processing and transporting the metal. These activities shaped daily life, creating patterns of work and settlement that were tied to the resource. The benefits were not evenly distributed and the risks were real. But tin provided opportunities, linking local effort to broader systems of exchange. It was a way in which the land beneath the surface influenced the lives of those above it. From a modern perspective, the movement of tin across such distances might seem inefficient or uncertain. But within the context of the time, it made sense. The demand for bronze was high, and the sources of tin were limited. Communities worked with the knowledge and resources available to them, developing systems that allowed materials to move despite the challenges. There was no alternative that could match the properties of bronze at this stage. Tin was not just valuable, it was necessary. The effort required to obtain it was justified by what made it possible. The Bronze Age did not last forever. Over time, iron began to replace bronze as the dominant material for tools and weapons. Iron was more widely available, reducing the reliance on long-distance trade for key resources. As this transition occurred, the importance of tin diminished. The networks that had once sustained its movement changed or disappeared. But the legacy of that earlier period remained. It had demonstrated that Britain could be part of a wider system, that resources could connect distant regions, and that the land itself could shape those connections. When thinking about the making of Britain, it's tempting to begin with the political structures, with kingdoms or with external influences such as Rome. But the story of tin suggests an earlier starting point. Long before these developments, the land was already participating in wider networks through the resources it provided. Britain was not isolated at the edge of the world. It was connected, not through identity or power, but through necessity and exchange. This challenges the idea of a clear beginning. Instead, it points to a gradual emergence shaped as much by geology as by human action. If Britain's earliest connections to the wider world were shaped by a single resource, what does that suggest about the role of necessity in creating networks? Do connections form because of shared identity or because of shared need? And how do those early patterns influence what comes later? Thanks for walking a little further along the path that made Britain with me. If you liked it, there's a button especially to let me know, and I'd really appreciate a click. If you subscribe, there's a whole back catalogue of videos like this for you to enjoy, including this one, chosen especially for you by YouTube. Have a look, they think you'll like it, and I'm sure you will. So thanks again for watching, take care, until next time, bye.